Hi, everyone. We'll be starting now. My name is Luis Basurto Villanueva. I'm the Executive Co-Director of the Duke Immigrant and Refugee Project, a pro bono group here on campus. Welcome to today's panel discussion on DACA, Resilience in the Face of Uncertainty. This is the last event in our Immigration on the Line series. We would like to thank all the co-sponsors that made this series possible. Please note that this event is being recorded. We ask that you remain muted and that your video remain off. We will have time for questions at the end of the discussion. Please feel free to send your questions to our moderator using the chat feature. Today's event is brought to you by the Immigrant Rights Clinic and the Duke Immigrant and Refugee Project, and is co-sponsored by the Heart Leadership Program, Duke Student Affairs, Latin American Law Students Association, Asian Pacific American Law Students Association, Middle Eastern and North African Law Students Association, Outlaw, American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights Society, Law Society, First Generation Professionals, and the Duke National Lawyers Guild. Before we start, DERP would like to express our gratitude to Kaden Muchin-Roseman for sponsoring this academic year's pro bono activities. Please welcome our moderator for today's event, Kate Evans. Kate Evans is a clinical professor of law and director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic here at Duke. She has supervised students in their defense of clients facing deportations and challenges and challenging their detention before the Immigration Courts, Board of Immigration Appeals, U.S. District Court, U.S. Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Kate has authored amicus briefs and scholarships focusing on the limitations of local law enforcement to engage in immigration policing.
I think you're muted, Kate.
I know, I didn't have the power to unmute. Luis
Okay.
is all powerful here, as well he should be. So thank you, Luis, and thanks for putting together this stellar panel. I was so excited to be part of this conversation and have a chance to talk with all of you about your outstanding leadership in many different ways. I'm excited to have a wide-ranging discussion that includes litigation strategies that have been really important and critical to protect protect options and simply sort of the well-being of individuals, as well as advocacy efforts outside the courtrooms to promote broader recognition of who is in our country and who we share our communities with, and what the treatment that we owe one another should be. So first, let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll dive right in. We're gonna have discussions kind of by topic, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to the audience. So we're thrilled to be joined by Reina Montoya, who grew up as an undocumented immigrant. She's spoken out about experiencing firsthand the fear, anxiety, and stress associated with having undocumented status in America. She founded Aliento to support the 6.5 million undocumented youth and children of immigrant parents through art, leadership development, organizing, and education. Reina is an honoree of Forbes 30 Under 30 for social entrepreneurs. We'll also hear from Vanessa Luna, who immigrated to the United States at the age of 10 from Lima, Peru, and grew up undocumented in New York. A first-generation college graduate, her undocumented experience drove her choice to pursue a career in education. Luna co-founded ImSchools in 2017 to provide educators the training needed to support the needs of over 30,000 undocumented students and their families nationwide. In 2019, she was selected as Forbes 30 Under 30 in education and an inaugural Time 100 Next list maker for her work and leadership in developing inclusive schools for immigrant families. And then next, we'll hear from Jeffrey Davidson, a partner at Covington and Burling San Francisco office. His trial and appellate practice focuses on high-stakes commercial matters. Clients have called on him to deliver results in some of the most important disputes, and he led the team representing the University of California in its challenge to the government's rescission of the DACA program, obtaining and defending on appeal the nationwide injunction that was under review at the Supreme Court. Okay, so first off, let's talk about DACA and its impact. I'm going to do a little primer just to make sure we're all on the same page with what this program is and where it came from, and its limitations as well. So DACA was announced by President Obama in June 2012, and in many ways was part of a response to congressional failures to pass the DREAM Act and other immigration reforms. The policy was announced as part of an exercise of prosecutorial discretion and the power that the executive has to choose where to focus its resources. So the memo described the limited resources that are available to the executive branch and the agencies, and therefore the requirement to choose where to focus them. And the decision by that administration not to focus them on individuals who filled these basic criteria of the DACA program. So you had to enter the United States under the age of 16. You needed very little criminal history. There were some exceptions for traffic violations and up to 3 misdemeanor offenses. You needed to be here already for 5 years. So at this point, that's looking, that was June 2007 to start the residency. You needed to receive a high school diploma, a GED, or be in school, or alternatively be honorably discharged from military service. You needed to be present in the United States on the date of the announcement in 2012, and you need to be under the age of 31 on the date of the announcement in 2012. Additionally, you needed to have no lawful status, and you also had to be older, and all of these remain true. You also have to be older than 15 in order to apply for DACA, unless you had a final order of removal. The program set out a case-by-case review, but these basic criteria for consideration. And upon approval, applicants receive a 2-year period in which the Department of Homeland Security will not seek their removal. This is the deferred action in the name Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which is what DACA is an acronym for. And then that initial memo left to USCIS the decision of whether to grant work authorization on the basis of that deferment. So here we are today, many years later, with these same requirements for the DACA program to receive the 2-year sort of stay of deportation and associated work authorization. Vanessa, I'd love to start with you to speak about how DACA has impacted you, and the community where you work and where you live.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. It is an honor to be here with you all and join these incredible panelists. So as it was mentioned, for me, DACA, I was a former DACA recipient. I am incredibly privileged and fortunate that I have been able to adjust my status and got my permanent residency card just last year through a spouse petition. I received DACA when I was in college. So it was my junior year of college. I was finishing up my graduate studies in Binghamton University in upstate New York. And it came at a time where I was about to graduate from college and I wasn't really sure what track I was going to go into. I was prepared and ready to continue cleaning houses with my mom, clean offices with my dad, babysitting, doing whatever I needed to do to survive and to continue thriving without this work permit. When DACA came out, I did see a complete shift in the opportunities that I was able to access, right? With having this social security number. At the time, there was no driver's licenses for undocumented folks in New York. So I was able to get a driver's license. I was able to gain access to internships I didn't have access to in the past. And finally, I was able to become a teacher. So I was able to teach and I taught in Los Angeles and then I taught back home in New York. And it really, really provided me, I think, an initial pathway to have access to opportunities that I was not able to have access to before, not because of my abilities, but because there were systems around me that prevented me from accessing those supports. And I see that continuously with the community members that we have the honor and the privilege to work with in our work at IMSchools. While DACA has provided many of them pathways, including many folks that are in our staff and in our team and provided also that protection from deportation, there's also this heightened need for individuals that are not eligible for the program. There's also this heightened need for parents and family members who are eager and very, very excited to support their students or their youth through the process, but not necessarily have a pathway for themselves to engage in that process. And so while we've seen the tremendous impact of DACA, and I've seen that personally, I also think it's important to understand that, especially, for example, newcomer youth who we engage with here in New York City, they're not eligible for the program. And I think the narrative has really definitely impacted our community in thinking about eligibility and who's kind of accepted in this country and who this country kind of not only welcomes, but also elevates in their thought around citizenship and access to citizenship or access to any type of relief.
Thank you so much. Raina, I wanted to move to you to speak about your reactions to DACA and the impact that you see, you know, and what that means for sort of what you're thinking about right now.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me in this space. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. This is something very personal. I'm still a DACA recipient. And what that means is that it has very mixed emotions. My story begins when I fled violence from Mexico to the United States. My family has a very unique story that now a lot of the new immigrants are very similar due to the corruption in Mexico. I unfortunately had to endure what it was like to flee a country with not knowing if I would remain would be safe for me and for my family. As a little girl at the age of 10, when we were leaving Tijuana, I didn't really know what was going on. It was something that my parents tried to shelter me, like any other parents trying to figure out what's going to be the courageous pathway for their family. So my dad made that very courageous decision when he had to flee violence and after being kidnapped, enduring so much trauma. And growing up in Arizona, it was very difficult. I think that many people know what Arizona stands for immigrants, having to endure Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who constantly would do raids and stop people at any time. And even though that we fought for so long, the SB 1070, show me your papers law, we continuously had to try to figure out that very thin line between navigating how to survive versus how to really have those hopes about what our communities really need to have dignity and respect. So something that I really like to say, that the DACA program was not given to us. There was years of advocacy. I remember talking to the Obama administration and they telling me that they couldn't do that. And the role of attorneys was very key, because at that moment, it was 100 attorneys, if I remember correctly, that they wrote a letter and they said, no, it is within his authority. And in Arizona, for me as a DACA recipient now, it meant that after graduating college, undocumented, not really having a pathway forward, I was able to get a work permit, not have to worry about if I was gonna get pulled over for any traffic violation, that I would be able to eventually have an opportunity to stay here. And then we also had to file driver's license. That's something that was very different than New York City. Like Vanessa said, it gave different opportunities. That's something that looked very different in Arizona. So for me, it's like what DACA symbolizes, it was that little hope, because I was working and organizing with undocumented parents at that time and with youth. And my mother, who was undocumented at that time, she got that courage. And I still remember that she took an airplane for the very first time and she went to Washington, D.C. in 2013 and started advocating for herself. And we organized with parents that came out of the shadows because they said, Raina, if the dreamers do it, we could do it too. And that was something, the power of winning and the power of envisioning, look, when we organize, when we come together, like something different can happen. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something that is really dear. It had tremendous personal impact from me being able to not be in deportation proceedings, from not being able to buy a home, being able to be an educator. I was a classroom teacher for 2 years and then decided to launch Aliento. That definitely those opportunities would have not existed without something like DACA.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And I see lots of people entering the discussion right now. We're really grateful for you joining us. I know a few people have raised hands. What would probably be the cleanest way to make sure we have an opportunity to discuss your questions and hear them is to direct those to Luis Basorta Villanueva, who can kind of organize those for us at the end here and make sure not to miss you while you your comments going. So thanks so much for the engagement already that we're seeing right now. Jeff, turning to you, you have, I think, a different experience here. Want to hear about sort of how you got involved in this issue and the impact it had on you.
Yeah. Well, so we represented the University of California in its litigation to preserve the DACA program when the Trump administration tried to rescind it. And Janet Napolitano, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security, who in the Obama administration sort of designed and issued the program, was at that time the president of the University of California. And, you know, her perspective on it and our perspective on it was sort of a practical one. I mean, there were 1,700 DACA recipients in the University of California, and the university, you know, its perspective was, you know, how can we protect our students from this administration? You know, one of the privileges of getting to do this work is getting to meet people like Vanessa and Reina, who have, you know, shown, you know, the power of what happens when, you know, when we change the immigration approach to, you know, broaden the community. And I mean, DACA is, you know, it's not close to what's necessary, but it has been transformative for, you know, about 800,000 young immigrants. And, you know, and if you look at just the statistics, it's one of the most successful social programs that has ever existed. I mean, the employment rate of DACA recipients, you know, skyrocketed, the wages of DACA recipients skyrocketed, and it had all these amazing consequences around the DACA recipients for their families and for DACA recipients who are teachers, you know, the students and, you know, where they taught or the schools where they worked. You know, when we fought this in the court system, you know, our approach was to try to look at it from, you know, all the way around. You know, we sort of thought of like the individual DACA recipient as kind of the hub of a wheel with like all of these relationships, and I think, you know, showing that you know, was powerful in the court system, and I think, you know, may be powerful in the public arena too.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to sort of talk about where we are right now with respect to sort of the current status of DACA, and then we can move on to where we might go moving forward. So first, you know, I think many folks are aware of the Supreme Court case on DACA and this notion that something survived. And it's certainly a very narrow decision. And Jeff, you know, we'll come back to you to get your thoughts on sort of where we're left at the end of this. But just briefly, in terms of reviewing what that decision said, that was this past summer, towards the end of this session, where we got finally a 5-4 vote in which the Trump administration's attempt to roll back DACA was rejected by the court. And so this took place over years of litigation, you know, as Jeff can attest to, and everybody experienced in a lot of different ways here. So as part of Obama's expansion of individuals not considered enforcement priorities at the end of 2016 and thus eligible for deferred action, 2015, he expanded the group eligible for DACA and removed the age cap, changed the date of entry, and extended protections for up to 3 years. And so it expanded sort of the scope of individuals who could receive at least some limited forbearance on deportation, as well as work authorization during that time. The program also included a new category of individuals, folks that Vanessa and Reina are talking about here, parents of United States citizens and lawful permanent residents. And that expansion of the enforcement priorities, or who was not an enforcement priority, was enjoined by a Texas district court, affirmed by the Fifth Circuit, went up to the Supreme Court and was affirmed 4-4 because Justice Kagan had recused herself. And so none of those expansions ever went into place, but the prior DACA program was left intact. Once President Trump took office, there were a lot of discussions early on in his administration about what might happen with DACA, a lot of mixed signals on that. And ultimately, in September of 2017, Attorney General Sessions issued a letter saying, hey, we think DACA is, or I think DACA is likely to meet a similar fate as the expanded prosecutorial discretion programs did. The DHS secretary then issued a memo saying, yeah, we think it should be, DACA should be terminated because of the litigation and because of the potential illegality, and created a wind down process. Before the program was actually wound down, though, Jeff managed to get an injunction. Many others got injunctions. Those injunctions held at the appellate courts. And so renewals were allowed to continue forward, but not new applications. And so we got a decision from the court that that was clear that the administration had the power to end this program, but basically didn't do it properly, that they didn't explain themselves well, that they can't sort of later add on a whole bunch of new reasons that were not actually explained at the point that the decision to rescind DACA was in fact made. Roberts talks about the obligation of the government to turn square corners with the people that it's governing and the failure of the administration to do so. And also highlights the fact that the Secretary of Homeland Security did not consider all the potential policy options and did not explain why full rescission was appropriate. And, you know, in a very summary way, but a significant way, I think, Justice Roberts also highlighted the incredible contributions and the reliance interests that were at stake in the case that really had not been considered by the Homeland Security Secretary, and just recognizing the wide-reaching impact that this program has had, including the impact on 200,000 U.S. citizen children. You know, in addition to the many other contributions and just, you know, being at the sort of fabric of many communities. So we have a very narrow decision on administrative law, and would love, Jeff, to hear your thoughts about where this leaves us. I'll just say one more point before turning it over to you. After the decision, there was an expectation, okay, this rolls the clock back to before September 2017. We should be allowed to start applying for new applications, for new deferred action recipients after this decision. That took quite a bit of significant work in the courts to actually get the administration to finally open up applications to new applicants. And because of the criteria I had said before, which you have to be over 15 in order to apply for DACA, there's a whole host of people, I think it was between 60 and 70,000 people who met the requirements, but had been left out during this period of renewals only. We finally do have clarity now from the administration that new applications are accepted as well as renewals. But you know, it was yet another fight after what seemed like a win on the big fight itself to get back to at least sort of a status quo situation.
Well, there's a lot in there, and I'll try to tackle a little bit, and would be very interested in Vanessa and Reina's, you know, perspectives on the litigation as folks who were directly impacted by it. You know, during the last administration, you know, our goal was preservation. You know, there was no chance that the Trump administration was ever going to expand, you know, immigration rights. And so, you know, our approach was to use the litigation toolbox to make it hard for them to do what they wanted to do. And so the tool that we used was the Administrative Procedure Act, which is kind of the fundamental law that, you know, governs how the US government is supposed to go about things. And we had, two main critiques of what the Trump administration had done. the first was that they had sort of taken this approach of, gee, we would really like to leave DACA in place, but we just can't because we're concerned that it's an executive overreach, and we just don't think we have authority to do that, and we're so concerned with being law abiding that we're sorry, but we have to do this. And it was always kind of ludicrous that no one thought that was their actual reason for doing it, but but we just said they're wrong about that. That the immigration system in the United States is set up so that there's 11 million people who the system deems to be undocumented and removable, and the largest number of immigrants who have ever been removed in any given year is 400,000. So just even if you wanted to exercise the law's full power, you couldn't. And so priorities have to be set, and so every administration sets these priorities. And so we said it's perfectly lawful to say that this category of people who have clean records and are and jobs and meet the criteria, like, of course that's not a priority for removal, and you can say that. So our critique number one was that DACA was and is perfectly lawful. And then our critique number two was the failure to consider reliance interests, which is kind of like a sterile way of saying it, but basically the administration never thought about the people who would be affected by what they were doing. And it was heartening to see Chief Justice Roberts pick that up in the Supreme Court case, and to say like when you do something as the government, you have to actually think about the consequences for the people you're going to affect. And that critique, I think, is has some staying power. Like, I don't think you could. I think another administration, coming in wanting to rescind DACA would find it very difficult to articulate, reasons that, would withstand scrutiny for why the program is unworthy. So those were our two main critiques. After the Supreme Court decision, now that there's been a change in administration, where we think that, their heart is in the right place and they want to preserve and expand DACA, one source of threat has been removed. There remains another source of threat, which is that Texas and a number of other states have challenged DACA in a case that's pending in Texas, claiming that DACA was unlawful in its inception. And so that remains a source of threat, and there's a lot of thinking on the policy level and the legal level about how to safeguard the program against that source of threat, in addition to expanding it if it's at all possible to do.
Yeah, and I think before moving to Vanessa and Raina, your reactions, I'd love to hear, Jeff, your thoughts on that pending Texas litigation. I know there's sort of this notion of, another shoe potentially dropping there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern. I mean, so the Biden administration, on the first day they came in, or maybe the second day, issued an executive order directing the whole of the government to figure out how to, I think they used a word like preserve and fortify the DACA program. What's come out of that so far is that the administration has indicated that they're going to go into a rulemaking process around DACA. They're going to take notice, they're going to issue notice of a new rule and take comments. And I think I think that's a constructive step, at least in terms of timing. And the Texas judge, one of his critiques of the DACA program has been that it was not subject to notice and comment rulemaking. And so it seems like a constructive effort to address that critique. The litigants were in the Texas courtroom last week talking about what the consequence of that rulemaking is, with the federal government advocating to just put that case, on ice while the rulemaking proceeds. And it seems very logical to me, but I think it remains to be seen what the Texas court will do.
Rainak, turning to you, what was your reaction and also your work potentially around the litigation that was years, in the making, with a lot of people's, lives rising and falling on the various decisions getting issued and appeals and following this process, in their day-to-day lives?
I would say that it has been a roller coaster for emotions for many of us who are within the DACA program, for our families. I love that Jeff talked about, typically when we think about DACA, we only think about the beneficiaries that are directly, but many people would come and talk to me because of the work that we do at Aliento. We work with DACA recipients, with mixed immigration status families, and there's two things that were very evident. One of them is that DACA recipients is not the only ones that you see with caps and gowns. There are mothers, as you mentioned, Kate. The fact that they are 200 US citizen children that their parents are DACA recipients was very evident. We have to have, that was a world before COVID. We had house meetings and we had conversations, and it was disheartening to have those very tough conversations that brought up so much trauma from my own childhood with having the similar conversation with my parents. What are you gonna do with the kids if you get in deportation proceedings? We started organizing family packets, have an emergency plan and a legal plan and a child care plan in case if someone were to be in deportation proceedings, because we didn't know how the enforcement was gonna roll out. The other thing is that, as it was mentioned, there were so many undocumented youth that no longer qualify for the program, and that prevented very tangible things like getting an internship, getting a job, getting a driver's license. So many of our youth started to experience a lot of anxiety and depression because they felt left out. I had conversations with a lot of our students that said, I feel forgotten and I feel that nobody cares about my livelihood. So I think that all these things were at a very personal level. And then Jed, having to maneuver all of that and really holding that space for folks while being impacted and also being a leader within the movement. It's about what are the windows of opportunity and how do we make sure we preserve and that we go in defense mode and trying to figure it out, how do we keep as many people here? I like to share the story that 2016, it became from day and night. I know that there's a lot of criticisms about the Obama administration. I was one of those advocating to extend different protections through the administrative arm and the congressional arm. Then yet, when I woke up after the 2016 election, we're a family of 5. My little sister, who's not so little, she's 13 now. She's a US citizen. My dad was in deportation proceedings, fighting his asylum case after being detained under the Obama administration for 9 months. My mom, who's undocumented, my brother and I, who are DACA. So before the 2016 election, I only had to worry about mom and dad. I mean, of course, DACA is not the same, but I only had to worry about mom and dad, what is gonna be their emergency package at the very microscopic level. And then November 9th, 2016, I had to figure it out, stopping deportations of 4 people, including mine. And that's what families were experiencing, because when we talked about the impact of this litigation, it's not only impacting DACA recipients that currently have the program, but it's impacting whole families. It impacts decision-making about what are you gonna do if you purchase a home, what are you gonna do in terms of career plans, but it also impacts the anxiety and the mental health. It's extremely nerve-wracking to wake up every single day at 5 a.m. in the morning to see if the Supreme Court was going to be ruling. So we had to create a wraparound support systems about, one, how do we provide immediate support, emotional and tactical support to families who are enduring this trauma? And then 2, how do we advocate? Because there's a lot of tensions within the immigrant rights movement about if you go to piecemeal approach and fight for certain segments of the population or for the whole population, but then the reality reality is that enforcement continues to go higher and higher. And that's the reality that we who are currently under threat of not knowing if the DACA program will continue are experiencing.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing all of that. And Vanessa, I also want to make sure to open it up to you too, to talk about just the experience of these last few years with watching the presidential election in 2016, the rescission in 2017, and all that's happened sort of just to get us back to the point, of where we were, basically in June 2012, right? That's all that work to get back to, kind of a status quo moment here.
Yeah, thank you. And I think just holding this space for what Reina shares is important, because she's, it's pieces around mental health and trauma that I think oftentimes when we're engaging in these spaces, we have to kind of revisit. So just want to make sure that we're holding space for that and acknowledging and respecting that piece. I think, as was mentioned throughout this thread, I think oftentimes when we think about immigration policy, we don't realize how it impacts other systems. And so our work at IMSchools is in the K-12 system. That's really where we work and who we interact with, students, families, and educators. And so, I mean, as a former teacher, and at the time I was a documented teacher and I was in the classroom when the 2016 election happened. And I taught the next day. And I taught in the Lower East Side of Manhattan of 6th through 8th grade middle school students who were from all over the world. Here in New York City, the immigrant population is extremely diverse, has different kind of linguistic availabilities. It is a beautiful, rich immigrant population that we're all deeply, deeply frightened around what had occurred in this so-called their country. And I think I clearly remember that moment of being in the classroom, of maneuvering that space with my students and also myself. And I've been fortunate, I think, just naming that, right, and have a set of privilege of being able to now have been able to adjust my status. And I think there's a lot that comes with that. I think in addition to that is really reflecting on those that are not in the moment to do so. And also understanding how this impacts systems such as a classroom, and how we, or for me, was educators having to navigate creating safe spaces within schools so that our students feel supported and that our families feel supported and have the resources that they need. That is truly what happened in 2016. And I've been aiming to do that ever since as a result of IMSchools, is to provide educators and really the K-12 system to think about, when they're thinking about educational equity, when we think about equity, when we think about justice, it has to also center immigrant justice as well. And you have to have those conversations, because oftentimes these conversations are happening in silos. And so it is often the very, very first spaces that we're engaging with when it comes down to the K-12 system, and having conversations around DACA, where our educators, students, principals, and some families, especially I think as a result of this moment, has led to a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding around what is happening, right? And also an added layer of distrust. You all know that the past 4 years, there's been continuous attacks, and even before then, as Reina mentioned, on our immigrant community, and particularly on our undocumented community. That chilling effect is still felt to this day when you walk into a classroom or into a school or attempt to have conversations with students and families. And so building that trust is really what we leaned on the most. But I also want to name that, as a result of that, we've seen former DACA recipients who were once documented. For example, there was a case here in New York, a person who was a former DACA recipient jaywalked in the Bronx. And as you all may know, the NYPD is we see it as another arm of ICE, or Immigration Customs Enforcement, even though they're not supposed to collaborate with one another. That former DACA recipient was arrested for jaywalking, which is, if anyone has ever been to New York, a lot of folks jaywalk in New York. And he was arrested. The NYPD then turned him over to ICE. Then he was detained for 9 months, and he was just released 2 months ago. And so while it is important to name the impact of DACA and the incredible implications it's had, it's also important to name the realities of some of the individuals that maybe have or have not been impacted by it. And as a result of all of this misinformation, dehumanization, xenophobia that we see in policies, it's having detrimental impacts in our communities within and outside of systems that are impacted by immigration policy.
Well, that is a very good transition, and I think, you know, reminder also of how big and sort of multi-pronged the work is here that you all do and that we all need to be doing here, and thinking about kind of where we're going moving forward, and what you all want to see, and how you work within the communities that, you know, that you're working within and living within to promote sort of the next round of change. And so we have DACA as it was announced in 2012 with no changes to those requirements. So now you have to have been in the United States, you know, for more than 13 years. I mean, many of the features of that program initially were already limiting in terms of who was covered and who wasn't. And those limitations, you know, with the passage of time are you know, all the more so. And we haven't seen changes to those. But as you all mentioned, the movement needs to be much broader than that, to actually respond to all of the complex dynamics and the nature of, you know, the family relationships and communities that are affected at this point. We have the House passage of the Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act just last month, but are hearing sort of more and more grumblings in the Senate, and also, you know, conversations around the potential for more comprehensive solutions, you know, and whether or not there will be a pathway forward there. I'd love to hear, you know, maybe Reina, starting with you, kind of what your priorities are for moving forward, and who you're engaging, you know, in those efforts.
We at Aliento started working with mixed status families in Arizona, and that our work has spread to the digital world and being able to have more access. It has spread to 44 states. So it's been a big responsibility to figure out what does that mean in terms of meaningfully engaging folks as we are thinking through so much uncertainty that has come up. There's no doubt that Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So for us, we have taken these different approaches. One of them is like, what immediately does the community need in order for them to continue to take their kids to school, to be able to continue to have food on their table. So we have done a lot of like wraparound support systems within the organization. Up to date, we have supported over 600 families with $500 cash assistance. We created letters to inform congressmen and women about the impacts of excluding mixed immigration status families out of the COVID and stimulus relief packages. So then that's been like one body of our work that we weren't necessarily doing. Most of our work is in the intersections of immigration, education, the arts, and mental health. And we go into the schools and we work in community to really transform that trauma that we have experienced into hope and action. And then the other side is about the advocacies. For us, it's really important that we center impacted communities and that the people who are currently have the skin in the game, right? That their lives are being impacted now, that they're the ones who are in the decision-making tables. I remember when I first started advocating for the DREAM Act back in 2010, most of the times people would ask me to share my story, but as soon as I brought up my strategy, they were like, no, we don't want to hear your thoughts. And that was the dynamic that we saw, how citizenship or immigration status was being weaponized about, you can be in the table, you can make decisions, or you're too emotional, you're just gonna settle for the crumbs because you're desperate. And I think for us at Aliento is how do we shift that we're not only storytellers, but we're strategists of our lives. So what we have been doing is we work specifically with a couple of the Congress folks who introduced HR 6. We did pressers created awareness. Our young people in the high school and in community college and universities have put up a lot of events where they are creating awareness about HR6, the Dream and Promise Act, the different avenues, what is happening currently at the courts, and how do we make sure we get to a solution and to a win. I think that there's this big fallacy that maybe because we have so much hope right now about being beat up in the immigration space for the past 4 years, that because we have a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, we're going to get to a legislative solution. And I'd like to say that it's a fallacy because it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take sacrifice, and it's going to take very difficult conversations about whatever policy recommendations that happen out of Congress. We know that it's not going to be perfect. We know that there's going to be trade-offs. And I think that the question that we have to ask to the immigrant community and the undocumented community is the solution better than the status quo? Or is it worse than the status quo, and who leaves behind? Because I think for us, the approach at Aliento, it's not about an either or, it's about a yes and. Just like DACA, we won. We knew that it wasn't what we wanted. We knew that the path forward was to continue to fight for the people who were left behind out of the qualifications. And we saw that when we organized afterwards, it worked. And we got DAPA, and Jeff, you did an amazing job about talking about the intricacies about stopping at core, but I think that shows the fact that when we're being cognizant about what is the avenue right now, how do we make sure we don't take an all or nothing approach? Because we know from historical record that an all or nothing approach will continue to give us nothing.
Thank you. And Vanessa, if we can turn back to you and hear what your engagement and advocacy looks like in the school system, and kind of what responses you're seeing there too.
Yeah, and I think, thank you all. I think, navigating through working within a system and then within that existing system to address another system is often really complex. And I think I do want to elevate that and name that. And I think that's why we strategically focus on that K-12 space, as well as seeing the need in regards to, not only our students and families, and also understanding this really dire disconnect between those that are directly impacted and those that are not, and understanding how some of these policies have an impact on our students and our families, and then also on the larger system. If we're thinking, for example, documented educators that are parts of our schools that have been engaging with our school community for years, and some who are principals, some of them who are leading schools or co-creating schools in a moment of deep, deep crisis in regards to COVID-19 as well. And so, similarly to right now, we've developed that type of financial support for our families, also thinking about executing and penning some of that regional work. We work across 3 states. So right now we are in Texas, in New York City, and we're in Camden in New Jersey. And so knowing that statewide policies and laws look really different, and it has to be led by folks with that regional context and that regional understanding, and especially, I would say, our parents. We've really, really leaned into our family members who identify as parents or guardians or caretakers, creating a space for them to engage and elevate in regards to their conversations and their concerns around school reopening in the intersection of immigration and immigration policy, as well as, there's a huge right now initial, I would say, campaign on funding excluded workers here in New York State. It's massive. We're really, really trying to push Cuomo to sign, and there's just a lot of implications within that around our families getting any type of financial assistance as a result of COVID-19. I think in addition to all of those components of that financial assistance, we also, I think, did a tremendous level of self-reflection as an organization that is led by Spanish-speaking Latina women. And in a moment of deep, deep, delayed racial reckoning in this country, we have to understand how immigration policy has the deep, deep impact on our Black immigrant community. And we, especially living and working in New York City, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and you have to understand, and you see that how it's played out in regards to criminalization and dehumanization, as well as how that happens in our schools when they're thinking about language justice and about providing supports in only English and Spanish. when you work in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and that is a rich, beautiful Caribbean immigrant population. And I think there is a further layer to it that you also have to understand what's going on right now in regards to the hate that the Asian community has experienced, not only the hate, but the violence, right? And understanding that the Asian undocumented community is one of the fastest growing Asian communities and undocumented communities. And we also have to understand that, because whenever I engage in these conversations, I don't want you all leaving and thinking that a person that looks like me is the only type of person that is impacted. And I think Jeff asked us a little bit about this as like, do you feel like this administration is more welcoming? And it's like, have you seen how many undocumented Black people they have deported in the first 100 days? Thousands of folks going back to Haiti, going back to Cameroon. And so I think if we're really thinking about intersection, that's some of the work that we are really, really deeply committed to as an organization. And also knowing fully that in order to really think about immigrant justice, you have to center that racial lens as well, and understand the deep implications it's having on our Black undocumented community, especially under this current administration.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn to some questions that have come in so far from the folks who are with us and listening today. These came in, especially in discussion of the DACA case itself and the continued challenge in Texas. Jeff, I'll maybe start with you. The question is, if the DACA program survives that challenge in the Texas court, do you think that would affect the urgency in Congress to move forward with any sort of more permanent legislative solution? And a sort of related, but maybe not, I'll just throw it in there while we're doing questions. Another question was speaking to the role of businesses and corporations in advocating for DACA and more broadly. And would love to get, Jeff, initially your questions on that, and then Raina and Vanessa, if you want to speak to those.
Yeah. I mean, I think taking those two pieces, something that came up during the litigation of like, well, if you're successful in protecting DACA, does that take the pressure off of the Congress, which otherwise might, pass some kind of legislative protection? And I think it's an interesting strategic question. My view on it has always been, you cannot count on the Congress, doing what's right. And it is entirely possible that if DACA were ended by court order, the legislative solution is not any kind of guarantee. Like a catastrophe is equally possible, I would say. So, I think from our perspective, it's you fight the defensive battle in the court to protect DACA, and then Raina and Vanessa and all of their allies, work on Congress to pass a much more, comprehensive immigration solution that gives, people a path to citizenship. I mean, that's the big goal, and it's a huge, heavy lift. And I think we need to, defend what we've got, and then go get more from the Congress. Is my perspective. I mean, on the business community, and maybe this ties into the Congress too. I mean, so we had like all of American civil society come into the DACA litigation. I think there were something like 38 amicus briefs in the Supreme Court from, hundreds of US companies and from teachers unions and coalitions of universities and law enforcement agencies and religious groups, every sort of angle of American society coming into the litigation to say, hey, here's our perspective on DACA and why it needs to be preserved. And I thought it was super powerful. And it one of the benefits of that is you can kind of connect with judges who may not share your whole perspective. And I think like Chief Justice Roberts, you could kind of I'm sure he's not an immigration activist, but he was able to see DACA recipients, maybe partially through that effort of, the parts of American civil society he does connect with. And I am hopeful that that engagement that, we were able to capture in the context of that litigation, shows up when the notice and comment rulemaking happens and when, the legislative activity happens. So I think, American business has a lot to, contribute if they're willing to this effort.
Raina or Vanessa, do you want to add anything there?
I think I just quickly want to add that I have seen also this layer of one, gratitude, right, around other individuals coming forward, and then also just a frustration of that we have to show some type of value, or there has to be some type of economic connection, or we had a conversation with lawyers who had a conversation with our parents around like having to show this trauma in order to access some type of immigration relief, right now for when you think about U visas, for example. And I just think it's important to name that it is, as has been mentioned throughout, hopefully you've heard this notion of like real human beings being impacted. And it's really, really important to also, as many folks that maybe are in the space or are thinking about engaging in immigration law, how is it that you're thinking about how you're going to support and address that continuous type of need around me giving you X, Y, and Z in order for me to get some type of relief. That kind of transactional activity that is deeply rooted in capitalistic practices, which is what this country has been made up about and continued to enact. But I just think it's important to name that because I've seen that continuously be an area. One, yes, gratitude, right? And I think we don't have to live in obsolete. We can live in spaces where we're feeling both gratitude and also kind of like frustration that's what families and people that are directly impacted have to do.
Yeah, I talked to my students in both the immigration clinic and the immigration law class about the very strange and harmful aspect of immigration law, which is this space where it says where we have to basically put an entire person's humanity and character on trial to decide if they're sort of worth reaching out to encompass by the law. And that, we just finished some immigration sort of court simulations and are preparing for things. And yeah, it's sort of the like every aspect of your life is interrogated and how we have to sort of examine a person's entire worth. If I were going in front of any of those proceedings and recognizing the privilege of not having to have my entire life and every last action and letter and contact that I've ever had, evaluated for its, overall merit. And that's that's not something we should be accepting of, in this space. Raina, I'm sorry, I didn't want to, I just wanted to jump in on that sort of dynamic, but certainly please add your thoughts here as well.
No, I really appreciate that. A lot of what really pushed me to found Aliento, I was very reluctant to actually create another organization, but time after time, I saw that the executive directors were citizens or were not longer impacted by the policies, and that changes the level of urgency. And for me, I think that the word that I come with is like, how do we lead with compassion and grace and humility? And what does that mean in different circles about having the compassion to understand that right now, yes, like there's so much pain and trauma that communities have endured, and then humility that we're not broken, that we're people, that we're human beings, that we're resilient, and then also the fact that that we can continue to find solutions even in spaces that might look very difficult. And I think about my parents, I think about the undocumented mothers that I get to see, the undocumented students that are coming out for the very first time in their classroom with their peers and saying, this is my story, this is my journey, but I'm not gonna allow my own life being just defined by my immigration status. And I think that work is so powerful. And I think that we as communities have to be able to decouple, like what is the work that we need to do for human beings, and then also how do we continue to educate folks about the policy making, because policy, unfortunately, the system, it's not meant to it's not meant or is not designed for us to thrive, especially immigrants. So how do we make sure that we understand the nuances and know that the law probably in times will protect us, and in times it's going to be the one that is going to be used to deport us, to separate us from our families? So how do we ensure that impacted communities also have that understanding, so then we know about not only the limitations but the potential opportunities? And I think for me, I think that sometimes it's really, really easy to get caught up in the day-to-day work, and maybe the, how do we make sure that we deepen our commitment and we go from allyship to champions? Because I feel that a big part that has happened with immigration, we continue to be at the bottom of the priority, and we don't have enough champions either in Congress, either our schools, or in different communities. So how do we have that humility to continue to listen to impacted leadership, but also do our work, because it's a journey? And I always think about, when I was in the classroom, I think about, okay, if I give a person a 12th grade reading level material and they are in 5th grade level reading material, if I give them the 12th grade level, they're probably gonna freak out. They're gonna completely shut down because it's not accessible for them. So how do we make sure that we're thinking about that teacher framework, that giving people the benefit of the doubt and knowing that maybe they can get there and they can be champions, but it's going to take a journey and it's going to take investment in communities, and to make sure that our actions truly reflect our values and what we preach.
Well, thank you. And we are at time. I want to maybe ask you all to take one last minute, if I could, for a final answer, which is thinking about the audience that we have right now of law students who are in pro bono projects. Like we're running a DACA renewal drive-through in my office window so I can get people signing documents and submitting things, but also recognizing, lawyers, the work of lawyers is limited too. We have support here from the university broadly. I think there's a number of undergrads and other students with us. So thinking about, what's your sort of pitch to them about things to get engaged with, both inside and outside the law? I know Jeff, our law student population would love to hear about, how do you get to do cool things like you did, within a law firm environment as well. So Jeff, why don't we kick it off with you, and then we'll go Jeff, Vanessa, and Raina, and we'll end it there. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, it was, I would say if you're committed to social justice, whether it's in immigration or any other area, and you're going to be working at a law firm, you really need to think about whether that firm is going to support you in in pursuing the public interest work that you want to do. And I think when you're interviewing with firms, I mean, that's a crucial question. And I was grateful, for my firm basically, giving me 24 lawyers to litigate, against the Trump administration for 3 years without sort of blinking an eye, as part of our, commitment. And there are other law firms that share that commitment, and then there are some that don't. And so, I think if this kind of work is important to you, there is an enormous need. There is enormous, infrastructure at the firms to support, pro bono work. But you got to pursue it, and you have to remember to chase after it. And I think it's, especially when you're kind of mid-career and you're looking for, advancement, it can be easy to sort of let it slip. But I would encourage people not to let it slip, and to, really make it, part of your practice from day one to, always be doing something to promote the public interest in addition to your own personal interest.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I'm thinking a lot about partnerships and who is it that you're connecting with and partnering with, because as I've mentioned, right, the need is so vast. And for example, we work with a few local organizations that are providing direct support, and oftentimes pro bono or at a limited cost. And they have noticed the high need around emotional support and mental health support. And so while they don't have those tools, they're able to partner with someone who can. Similarly to around, for example, for us is the K-12 system, right? And these are some things that they see, so then they connect with us to partner and bring that forward. So I think a conversation that I would urge you all to have is thinking about, who are you partnering with? Who are you connecting with? Who are you engaging with? And then another component in that, which I think we alluded to already, is like, how are you centering human beings? I think it becomes really difficult when we're talking about these policies, right? And the way in which sometimes we talk about it, it feels very dehumanized. And so how is it that we're recentering humans? And while, yes, we're elevating their power and their continuous resiliency and their joy, y'all, like, our community is filled with joy continuously. You should see our family WhatsApp group. It is filled with joy continuously, especially after Easter yesterday. They were sending us a bunch of pictures of what they cooked. And we're hoping to do some in-person things, fingers crossed, soon. But I also think it's important to, yes, the joy is there, the power, the resilience is there, and naming the systems that are unjust. And so you're going to become a part, just like I am. I'm a part of different systems, including the K-12 system. It was not built for people like me or people that have come after me. And so how is it that you're making sure that it is more equitable and more just, and centering yourself on that?
Thank you. I think for me, when I try to put myself in your shoes, it goes back to the fundamental thing that we are all human beings. And if we honor that, if we hold that in our hearts, we have to think about how do we make sure, if we are really centering the lives of people when they're coming to your door, and they're going to be interacting with the receptionist, what is the thoughtfulness that it is from welcoming them? What would welcoming your clients or your future clients would look like? What would it look like when they have to share most of the traumatic experience of their lives? Like, I had to see my dad share about how he got a gun into his head, and that's why he decided to flee violence. And he was one of the lucky ones that he wasn't murdered. But having to endure that and repeat that time after time, what is the due diligence and the care that you talk to your clients about, and making sure that they have those support systems. I am a firm believer of collaborations, just as Vanessa mentioned. It's like, you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to become an expert on trauma. You don't have to become an expert on education field. You don't have to even become an expert on the country that people are coming from, but you do have the responsibility to treating people with that sense of humanity and honor and dignity. So for me, very tangible is like, how do you center people in it? And you look from the first moment that they step into that Zoom, maybe that Zoom chat when they're coming in, or maybe it is in person, depending on where you are from. How are you collaborating with local communities that provide wraparound support systems for immigrants, to making sure that they get that community and that care and that support that they need and that they want to? Nobody wants to be alone in this world. How do we support that and enable that and become conductors and connectors? And 3, very tactical, we do need your pro bono support. There's so many communities that are in need of that. So if it would have not been for our amazing attorneys or law students who are willing to navigate now Zoom and learn about it and provide virtual support system to apply for DACA or a U visa or many other different parts of relief, like, our folks would have not been protected from deportation. And that's a reality. So your time and your effort and your human-centered approach really, really matters as we're thinking about supporting human beings.
Well, thank you all so much. It was just such a privilege to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate your time with us today, and look forward to sharing this resource out going forward as well. A lot to think about here and be mindful of. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks, Raina.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Hey, everyone.